My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask pardon for my sins and the grace to make these moments of prayer fruitful. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. I went round to visit a family quite some years ago, and we sat down to talk in the lounge room. As tends to happen on these occasions, they brought out some things to snack on for afternoon tea. But it turned out that the conversation was so engrossing that we all got immersed in talking to one another and completely forgot about the afternoon tea. Well, when I say we completely forgot, that's not strictly speaking true, because there was one young girl there. She was 4, going on 5 years old, very young. And she most certainly had not forgotten about the afternoon tea. In fact, I was a bit oblivious to it myself, but it seems that she was little by little sidling her way up to the coffee table, eyeing the chocolate biscuits. And at a certain point, sure enough, she reached out and took one. Her mother said to her, we'll call the girl Rachel, said to her, "But Rachel, you know you're supposed to ask before taking a chocolate biscuit." And the little Rachel looked up at her with big round eyes and a big mouth still half full of chocolate biscuit and said, "I forgot." Well, her parents kind of chuckled slightly, and while I was looking very bemused, they explained to me she's realized that if she does something just by forgetting, then she's not guilty of doing anything wrong. Well, that little girl obviously hadn't started to understand fully the moral law, but she at least had started to realize that the reaction from her parents was going to be different if she was guilty or not. The funny thing is, the same thing does happen to us even though we understand the moral law, or perhaps especially because we understand the moral law. We fear guilt, just as we fear failure in general. We fear being confronted by the reality that we aren't who we want to be. And of course, we've always got this little devil inside us, which we call pride, which struggles to be reconciled with the fact that I've done something wrong. As everyone knows, this is particularly prevalent in the 21st century, where we're continually bombarded by images and ideals of perfection which are completely unachievable. This leaves your typical citizen of 21st century Western culture almost perpetually anxious about everything they're not achieving and everything they're not doing, basically the perfection that they're not fulfilling. But while there are certain problems typical of 21st century culture, there are other things in the spiritual life which have always been this way. In fact, when it comes to sin, people have always struggled to accept their own sinfulness. They have always struggled to accept the fact that they've committed evil, that they've done something wrong. And you can see this right going back to the first sin, the very first one. If we go back to Genesis chapter 3 and look at the original sin, what happens? Everyone knows this story. Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit. God comes to the garden in the evening and he confronts Adam. And Adam responds, "Look, it was the woman, the one you gave me. She gave me the fruit and I ate." And then he goes to talk to Eve. And Eve says, "Look, it was the serpent. He deceived me and therefore I ate." This is one of the great tragedies of sin, and of our inability to recognize it most specifically, that sin alters our dynamic with the truth. It alters our perspective of the truth, the way we see it, and consequently, it alters the way that we interact with others as well. Just looking at that original sin, you see the way that Adam and Eve related with one another was obviously changed, because suddenly there was a projection of guilt upon the other. Now, we can't underestimate the impact that that has on human relations. We're just the same. That inclination not to accept the fact that we have sinned alters our perspective of reality, and in the end, alters our relationships with others, including our relationship with God, or perhaps especially our relationship with God. Things don't go well in general in human life when we can't perceive what reality is, or we don't understand our relationship with it. You can see that, of course, in any one of a number of medical conditions. The one which comes to mind to me at the moment, probably because I've been in very close contact with it, is anorexia. This is a condition which causes people enormous suffering, and a common trait is that the patient is convinced they're overweight, while in fact they're incredibly underweight. Their perspective of reality is somewhat distorted, and that causes enormous suffering. Now, of course, that's a medical condition which needs to be treated with medical means. But there are analogies in the spiritual life as well. In general, we're happiest and things go best when we see ourselves in accord with the truth, when we see ourselves as we are. Now, that's all very well, you're going to tell me, but let's get back to the question about sin. How on earth am I supposed to be happy with my sin? How is recognizing my sin going to make me a more cheerful person? How is my being sinful supposed to make me at peace? And especially, of course, we look at the case of someone who desperately wants to conquer a sin or a defect and can't get over it. How is that person possibly going to be happier by recognizing their sin? That's exactly the thing which dominates them. Well, thankfully, we have the answer in today's gospel. This is where Jesus goes to eat at the house of a Pharisee called Simon. And then a woman of bad reputation, Luke tells us, walks in and weeps over the feet of Jesus, cleanses them and dries them with her hair. Of course, the Pharisees complain and say, well, if he was a prophet, he would have known what kind of woman this is. And for that reason, this gospel is often used to talk about the fact that we should not judge, that we should accept all people. And that's true. But there's more to it than just that, which Jesus himself tells us at the very end of this gospel passage. He says, talking to Simon, "Therefore I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven her. Hence she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little." And that's the key. Recognition of sin brings peace because we have forgiveness. When someone recognizes their sin and realizes that they have been forgiven, they can't help but love the one who forgives. For us, recognizing our sinfulness, recognizing who we are, helps us to love God more, helps us to understand and love Jesus Christ, because we realize we're forgiven. Just think, for example, what was going on in the heart of the woman in today's gospel. She was a woman of ill repute. I think we all know what that refers to. She was most likely despised by everyone in the town, at the very least thought ill of. Her life would have been miserable, really miserable, and she would have been trapped by her sin, because there was no way out. Her reputation was made, and her sin only seemed to bring her further condemnation, because there was no way out. There was no forgiveness. There was no starting again. And then somehow she hears about this person called Jesus Christ. How, we don't know. The gospel doesn't explain that to us. But she goes to him desperate to recognize her sin because she knows that there is forgiveness in Jesus Christ. And how massively she could unburden herself, just like us, if we choose to recognize our sin. Weeping upon the feet of Jesus Christ. Well, quite possibly we're not going to weep for our sins, not literally, not physically, but interiorly, in a certain sense, yes, because we realize that with God, starting again really means starting from a clean slate. That no matter what we have done, it's all gone, because forgiveness in God is complete. That nothing we have done, and nothing we ever will do, can possibly limit his forgiveness, which is absolute. Like this, we learn to love our sinfulness. We learn to love our sinfulness because it brings us closer to the forgiver. The more we are forgiven, the more we love. The more we recognize our sinfulness then, the more we are able to love, because we realize we're forgiven. This is a very different thing to loving one's sins. Obviously, no one should love their sin. In fact, when we bring them to the sacrament of reconciliation, we bring them as things repented of. And that's what makes reconciliation with God take place. So no, we don't love our sins. We don't want them. In a very real sense, we despise them, even if at the time we didn't. But we love our sinfulness, because recognizing that brings us closer to Jesus Christ. Well, Lord, perhaps we can turn our hearts directly to you now and tell you we need help with that too. Because just like every single person on earth, we too have the inclination to not accept our sin when we see it, to not accept our failings, with all the problems that brings. So, Lord, teach us to have that simplicity of heart. Teach us to realize that forgiveness in you is absolute. Because I think when we understand that, we can understand the goodness that there is in recognizing our sin. We can go there without shame. And Lord, you know we want to go straight to you. We want to have that forgiveness. We want to have that peace that comes from you. let's move away from the woman of today's gospel and think about a very different gospel woman, which is the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, if we look at things really humanly, kind of taking ourselves as an example, you would think that being so perfect would lead the Blessed Virgin Mary to look down on people who weren't. But of course, we know that's not the case. Her perfection didn't lead to pride, but to humility. That's what we see played out in the Magnificat, that song which falls from her lips when she goes to see her cousin Elizabeth. She, more than anyone else in this world, had the freedom of knowing herself in truth. And that didn't lead her back to herself, but it led her directly to God. And that's the same thing we ask of her, that our self-knowledge, our recognizing our sin, might lead us to God. That way we can truly love our sinfulness, because in that we discover forgiveness, we discover who God is, and we are led to love him more. I thank you, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations which you have communicated to me in this time of prayer. I ask your assistance in putting them into effect. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.